Jamie here from History Hiccups. Today we're going to be talking about Alabama Scoundrels, okay? Bloody Bob Sims. And I'm going to be reading from the book Alabama Scoundrels, Outlaws, Pirates, Bandits, and Bushwhackers from Kelly Kazek and Will Elrick, okay? So stay tuned. It's gonna be Bloody Bob Sims, a prophet and the Choctaw County War. It was Christmas Day, 1881, and more than 500 people had gathered from across southeast Alabama, determined to see the end, once and for all, of Bob Sims, his lawless church, and his bloody ways. Those who weren't there to physically force Sims to justice were there to witness it. It was more excitement seen in Choctaw County's history. The posse surrounded the Sims home, cornering Sims, his wife, their children, and several church members known as Semites, or Semites, something like Simsites. The local sheriff led the mob and sent orders for someone to go fetch the old Civil War cannon from Bladden Springs to blast Sims out. "Sims," someone hollered, "we're bringing in the cannon." The weapon was taking too long to arrive, so a few of the men reportedly cut down a tree and blackened the trunk in an effort to spook Sims. It worked. Soon Robert Sims shouted from the house and made an offer. He'd give himself up if Sheriff Gavin would promise to protect his followers from the angry mob. The sheriff agreed he'd do what he could and took Sims, Tom Savage, and Tom's nephews, Will and Tyree Savage, into custody. Sims' wife and daughters were also arrested. Finally, Bloody Bob Sims was in custody. But would townspeople be satisfied with that? Robert Bruce Sims was born in Bladden County, North Carolina in 1839. He married a woman named Elza, and they started a 240-acre farm in Choctaw County, Alabama. They raised two sons, Lachias Bailey and Epidamna. What in the world? I don't know that word, that name, and four daughters, Laura Claire, Ruby, and Elizabeth. Outwardly, Bob Sims was an unlikely outlaw. A Confederate veteran who fought with the 22nd Alabama Infantry, Sims was injured and captured by Union troops and imprisoned at Camp Morton in Indiana. Following his harrowing experiences in the Civil War, Sims resumed farming in the Walnut Hill community of Choctaw County, and at one time served as county road surveyor. For a time he lived peacefully among his neighbors, but a series of court cases changed his outlook towards authority. In one case, after threatening his brother-in-law, Sims was found guilty of using insulting language and fined $20. He grew angry with the court system and its insistence on having him swear an oath, which he said violated the laws of God. In one court case in which Sims was involved, he referred to Judge Luther Smith as Satan. The family attended the local Methodist church, but as Sims' beliefs grew more divergent from standard teachings, he became at odds with local pastors. For instance, on one occasion, Sims reportedly attended a church revival at which the pastor asked members to kneel at the altar. Sims refused, saying it was against his beliefs to bow to anyone but God. That's my belief too. In 1877, he purportedly was attending Womack Hill Methodist Church until one Sunday he suddenly proclaimed the church was abusing the gospel and caused such a scene that he was convicted of disturbing a church service, a crime at the time, and fined $75. Unhappy with any denomination, Sims began his own church and preached a strict adherence to the Old Testament and observed Sabbath on Saturdays, which I do too. I observe the seventh day Sabbath. According to legend, his ability to remember and quote biblical passages was nothing short of astonishing. Eventually, he amassed more than 100 followers, including his family. He began publishing a pamphlet called The Veil is Rent, which became his church's doctrine. In one article, Sims calls for the destruction of civil authority because it was the devil's work. The trouble for the Semites began when Bob Sims started a moonshine business. Believing God's was the only true law, Sims did not follow man's law and believed he did not have to pay taxes on land, goods, or his liquor. But you do have to pay because Jesus Christ says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So that's the reason we pay taxes, okay? But not only did pastors of other local churches disapprove of his teachings, but they also felt liquor was the devil's work and loudly preached against its evils at every opportunity. The fighting began in 1891 when one of Sims' followers wanted to court the daughter of Reverend Richard Bryant Carroll, a pastor from Sowippa who preached against Sims' moonshining. On May 1st, Carroll turned up dead. Carroll allegedly sent his daughter's suitor away, and someone returned that night and shot Carroll dead on his porch. Although no one was arrested, members of the community suspected Sims and his followers. The Reverend Carroll, now listed as the first fatality of the Sims War, was buried in Harrison Cemetery as townspeople began to wonder how to handle the growing problem of Bob Sims and his religious sect. Several people reported Sims to federal authorities in Mobile for moonshining. One of those citizens was local store owner John McMillan, whose fate would be intertwined with Sims before the year was over. By the time area newspapers had begun reporting the goings-on in Choctaw County, calling Sims Church a sect, whose members believed Sims was their prophet. On May 28, 1891, the Hamilton Times in Marion County reported another incident in which Sims' followers refused to follow government rule. The newspaper reported, one of this sect was called to serve on the jury in the United States court here today, May 25th. He refused to take an oath because a biblical prohibition was permitted to affirm. Then he announced that he would never convict anyone because the Bible says, judge not. Inquiry shows that the brother of this juror, a man named Robert Sims, S-I-M-M-S, runs an illicit distillery in Choctaw County. And when the deputy marshal served a warrant on him last week, Sims tore the document to pieces, saying that he was under no man's authority. His brother says there is no concealment in the case. Sims claims that he has the right to do as he pleases, that any attempt to stop his distillery will be religious persecution. Excuse me. That summer, the federal marshal and his men made several attempts to capture the moonshiners, but during each raid, the Federals were outnumbered. Finally, in late summer, the Federals caught Sims unaware and were able to take him into custody and ride to Bladden Springs to await a steamboat to transfer Sims to jail in Mobile. While the men were giving lodging in a local hotel, Sims was placed under guard in an outbuilding. Late that night, Sims' brothers Jim and Neil and his son Bailey Sims rode into town along with 3 Simsites. They managed to break Bob Sims from his jail, but the ensuing gunfight, Bailey Sims was killed, along with a bystander, Dr. A.B. Pugh. Jim Sims was injured and captured. Townspeople grew nervous of Sims' retribution for the death of his son and capture of his brother. The federal marshals stayed on to help protect the public. But soon, nerves turned to outrage, and residents tired of the Semites' bloody ways, retrieved Jim from his makeshift cell 2 days after Sims escaped and hanged him from a nearby tree. The bodies of Bailey and Jim eventually retrieved by some of Bob's children, and the men were buried in the Sims cemetery behind the Sims home. The Federals, ill-equipped to deal with the Sims clan, returned to Mobile with the intent of returning with some supplies and men. But the townspeople were growing impatient, and the Federals approach and with the Federals' approach, and wanted the Sims stopped. A posse of local residents formed and rode out to the Sims house in search of Bob and Neil. The men were not at the homestead, so members of the posse issued a warning: get out of Choctaw County or else. A few family members who feared for their lives, including 2 of Sims' daughters, left to live with family in Mississippi. All through that fall, Bob and Neil managed to remain in hiding. Sims' daughters, who had taken refuge in Mississippi, returned home, purportedly with a promise from the governor that they would remain unmolested. In Sims' absence, yet another lawsuit was filed in Choctaw County Court, and the Sims homestead was put up for auction to pay a settlement ordered by the judge. The news drew Sims from hiding, and he returned to prevent his home from being sold. In the meantime, Sims was also nursing a grudge against a local businessman, John McMillan, who owned a store in Paragon. Rumors had flown that McMillan was the first to turn in Sims to federal agents, and Sims wanted revenge. But his vengeful act would be the last straw for residents. On December 22nd, 1891, Sims and his henchman, Will Savage, waited at the crossroads near Gilberttown and hijacked a wagon hauling merchandise to McMillan's store. After the merchandise was unloaded, Sims gave the driver a message: tell McMillan we're coming for him. and we're going to burn his house down. The driver duly warned McMillan, who gathered a group of men to stand guard on his property that night. When nothing happened, McMillan assumed Sims' threat was idle and made the fatal decision to call off the guards. Newspapers of the time gave numerous accounts of what happened next, but most agree that Sims and some of his followers surrounded McMillan's home just past bedtime on December 23rd and set it ablaze. Those living inside, including women and 10 children, awoke to smell of smoke, and one by one ran from the burning home. As they exited the home, Sims and his followers opened fire, indiscriminately killing anyone who ran out. When the shooting stopped, one adult and 3 children were dead, and at least 9 others, including Belle McKenzie, a young teacher boarding at the home, were wounded. Belle died from her wounds 3 weeks later. This Sims, Bob Sims, claims he's a Christian observing the seventh-day Sabbath, and yet he goes out and does this. That's not a Christian, y'all. That is not a Christian. Okay. This series of events led to the Christmas Eve siege of the Sims home, which by that point was fortified with weapons and supplies. The citizens, with little patience left for Sims' violent ways, were ready to take matters into their own hands and had already found and lynched Bob's brother, John Sims, that same night. The local sheriff was doing his best to orchestrate a surrender. The angry mob waited throughout Christmas Eve and into Christmas Day for Sims to come out of his homestead. Several barrages of gunfire were exchanged until finally, under threat of cannon fire, Sims gave up late Christmas Day. On December 27th, 1891, the New York Times reported when Sims heard of this preparation to blow his stronghold to splinters, he looked at his womenfolk and his heart misgave him. He began a parley with the sheriff at 2 o'clock. He said he would surrender if the posse would do him no injury and if the posse would protect him from mob violence. The men discussed the proposition for 2 hours. The newspaper account said, at first the proposal of Sims was flatly refused, but the fact that there were women in the house was a strong point in favor of mercy for the inmates. The thought of shooting with a cannon into the house harboring women was so repugnant that it overcame the almost wild longing for the blood of the men outlaws, so that at last the terms of Sims were accepted. Man, how times have actually stayed the same and have changed from then to now. Now they wouldn't care that women were in the house, okay? But anyway, the sheriff took Sims into custody, as well as Tom, Will, and Tyree Savage, promising Sims he would do what he could to keep the angry mob at bay. Several news accounts report that Sims' wife, daughters dressed in men's clothing had taken part in murders at the McMillan homestead on account that an account that had never been proven. However, newspapers, including the New York Times, reported 4 women were taken into custody along with Sims and the Savages to be transported to jail at Butler. Escorted by a posse of 25 men for protection, 2 wagons headed for the jail. one carrying the men and another the women. Soon the angry mob caught up with the wagon, and the 4 men were jerked from inside and strung up on nearby trees. The Times reported Bob was asked if he had anything to say. He replied, "Take my hand, feel my pulse, and see if I'm a coward." Within minutes, the 4 men were dead. The women, however, were spared. The New York Times reported on December 29, 1891, that casualties were still being tallied in the Sims War. The newspaper account reported that in addition to the 4 men hanged on Christmas Day and John Sims, who was hanged on Christmas Eve, townspeople had hanged Bob's nephew, Mosley Sims, and were in pursuit of another follower who reportedly took part in the McMillan family massacre. The Times reported, "The most alarming thing about this situation is that Neil Sims, the brother of Bob, and who rescued Bob from the deputy marshal at Sladden Springs in Choctaw County, August 20th last, is still at large and is determined to avenge Bob's death. Neil is a desperate man. He firmly believes that his brother was a prophet from God." Not so. And had divine sanction to kill off the devil's agents, namely the officers of the law. Neil Sims had collected nearly 40 of the Simsites and sent word Sunday that he intended to assault and burn the village of Walmart Hall before the night of that day. The people were greatly excited, and all of Sunday were massing at Walmart Hill to defend the place. The enraged people on Saturday morning, after the lynching of Bob Sims and his 4 followers, wrecked Sims' house and burned it to the ground. Then killed every living thing on the place except the members of the family, who escaped to a neighbor's house and who will move as soon as possible to another state. The bodies of Bob Sims and of the 3 savages were taken down Saturday and thrown over the wall into the graveyard. Sims' family and followers who were lynched that Christmas season were eventually buried in the Sims family cemetery, where their tombstones remain a testimony to the war begun by Bloody Bob Sims. Alright, hope y'all enjoyed, and see you back soon. Bye.